Hello everybody, Shrouded Hand here. A few years ago I covered the strange case of the Wallerton Gnomes. If you want to know the full story then go watch that video. But basically in 1979 a bunch of kids were walking across Wallerton Park one night when a number of small gnome-like creatures emerged from the trees and chased them around in bubble cars. The kids were later asked to describe and draw what they had seen, and their descriptions were oddly consistent. So whether they did see something strange that night, or whether they were just playing an elaborate prank is not really known, but I guess that's part of what makes these stories interesting. Obviously, tales like this should be taken with a heavy pinch of salt, but there's always the possibility that there's more to it than just childish imagination. So I thought I'd take a look at 3 similar cases from the UK. These all happened within a short space of each other. Kids claiming to see something inexplicable. The first story happened in the northeast of England. Around noon on the 28th of May 1964, 13-year-old Keith Bell spotted a silvery disc-like object hovering over Lem Lane farm. 3 days later, at around 11:30 p.m. on the 31st of May, Keith Bell and his family saw 3 luminous egg-shaped objects passing across the sky in the direction of Lem Lane farm. About an hour later, multiple residents of Lem Lane were awoken by a loud buzzing noise described as sounding like a swarm of bees but 20 times louder. 2 days later, on the 2nd of June at around 4 p.m, 4 boys were playing on the Lem Lane estate when they saw a strange object flying overhead, a silver-domed craft about the size of a table with portholes around the top and 3 legs. The object fell lightly through the sky like a leaf falling to earth, and then they lost sight of it. About an hour and a half later, 14-year-old Mark Smith was walking along Lem Lane towards the farm. He was going to collect some straw for his rabbits. As he got towards the farm fence, he noticed what he thought was a group of children playing around one of the haystacks, but as he got closer, he realised that these were not children at all. What he saw was about 6 or 8 small humanoid creatures. They were about 2.5 feet tall and wearing bright green suits. By the time he'd got close enough to observe them properly, the creatures had climbed up on top of the haystack. They all seemed to be digging into it with their hands as if searching for something. Mark was still about 30 meters away at this point, and he was too scared to get any closer, so he didn't get a good look at their features, but he did notice that their hands appeared to be glowing like electric light bulbs. Mark ran home and told his parents what he'd seen. Obviously they didn't believe him, but around the same time other children began to come forward reporting strange sightings of little men and flying silver objects, all seen around the vicinity of Lem Lane farm. The farmer who owned the land said the whole thing must be a hoax. He'd never seen anything strange, and his dog, who he'd kept in the yard, would have alerted him if a flying saucer had landed in his field or little glowing green men were running about the land. Pretty soon though, researchers from the Tyndale UFO Society caught wind of the story and they went to Lem Lane to interview the witnesses. The kids enthusiastically came forward with their stories. Apparently one girl had also seen the entities, and she told them that the leader of the group wore a black uniform and carried a pink striped baton. Another child claimed to have seen one of the little men watching them from the roof of a barn. A third child told them that she'd seen one of them riding around on the back of a cow. Yeah, I'm not sure what to make of these stories, to be honest. I get the impression that perhaps Mark Smith did see something strange. Whether it was little green men, who knows, but by the sounds of it, once the paranormal researchers got involved, other kids started making up wild stories just so they could be part of it. Then again, little men riding around on cows and clambering on top of barns, it does sound like typical gnome behaviour. According to the late John Knifton on his blog post about the incident, the road that runs alongside the farmland was once a Roman road which would likely have been built on top of an ancient Celtic path. Also on the farm, very near to the road, is a natural spring where water flows out into a stream. In Celtic mythology, springs were often seen as portals to the other world where water would flow from one world into our own. So Knifton theorises it could be that Lem Lane Farm itself acts as a kind of interdimensional doorway, allowing gnomes and fairies to pass freely into our realm. Or it could just be kids making stuff up, I don't know. So from the northeast of England, we now go to the northwest, the city of Liverpool. Less than 1 month after the Lem Lane sightings, on the 2nd of July 1964, local papers began reporting that large crowds of children were invading the Jubilee Park bowling green in search of leprechauns. Quite how this all started is not quite clear, but according to the articles, for the last 2 days, the park had become overrun with hundreds of children searching frantically through the bushes and trees in hope of catching one of the little people. As the search went on, the children became increasingly frantic and unruly. They started throwing stones, tearing up plants, and generally getting into scuffles. The problem became so bad that the police had to be called in. An emergency first aid stand was set up in the park, and the park warden had taken to wearing a crash helmet as he patrolled the land. One news article from the time has a statement from a 9-year-old boy who claims to have seen them. Last night I saw the little men with white hats throwing stones and sods at each other on the bowling green. Honestly, mister, I did. Descriptions of these leprechauns varied, but the eyewitnesses seemed to be in general agreement that they were very small in stature and wore conical hats, which to me sounds more like a classic gnome than a leprechaun. One possible reason why they believed these creatures were visitors from Ireland is that just before this leprechaun hunt started, there were sightings of strange objects glistening in the sky, whizzing over the river to the city from the Irish Sea. From Jubilee Park, whispers of the leprechaun invasion rippled out across the city, and pretty soon there were gangs of kids invading churchyards and derelict buildings in search of them. In particular, the town of Kirkby, about 5 miles north of Jubilee Park, seemed to be a focal point for the leprechaun panic. Scores of children reported seeing small humanoids about 8 inches high with red and green tunics. Interestingly, these Kirkby sightings were also accompanied by sightings of strange things in the sky, with lights that changed from red to silver. The leprechaun panic caused chaos across Liverpool, but after a few weeks it died down. Nobody really knows why it stopped or how it started. One possible explanation comes from a 1982 article in the Liverpool Echo titled True Confessions of the Liverpool Leprechaun. It features the testimony of a man named Brian Jones, who claims to have started the leprechaun scare himself. According to Brian, on the day before the panic started, he was in his grandfather's garden doing some weeding. The garden was covered in extremely high weeds. The garden also had a high wall that backs onto the park. Brian was stood in the garden wearing navy trousers, Wellington boots, a denim shirt, a red waistcoat and a woolen hat with a red bobble. He paused for a moment with his pipe in his mouth, and then he heard a noise behind him. When he looked up, he saw a group of children sat on top of the high wall looking down at him. He heard one of them whisper to his friend, "It's a leprechaun." As I say, Brian was stood among extremely high weeds. This factor, combined with the high angle that the children were looking down on him from, may have given the impression that he was much shorter than he actually was. Combine this with his red tunic and bobble hat, and you have your leprechaun. Realizing the children's mistake, Brian decided to play along. He started jumping up and down and throwing clods of earth around and babbling in some sort of gibberish leprechaun language. The children, he says, ran off terrified, but they returned the next day with hundreds of their friends, and so began this mass hysteria event. At least according to Brian it did. Many people have questioned whether this story really does explain the origins of the leprechaun panic. For one, it seemed unlikely that a fully grown man in a bobble hat could look so convincingly like a leprechaun that it fools a bunch of school kids. There's also an issue with the timeline of the article, which doesn't quite line up with the known start of the panic. According to the story that Brian tells, he first appeared in the garden scaring the children, and then the following day hundreds of kids were in the park looking for him. The day after that, which he says was a Saturday, even larger crowds had gathered. However, newspaper reports from 1964 indicate that this leprechaun hunt began on June the 30th, a Tuesday. Based on that, it seems much more likely that by the time the children first saw Brian in his garden, the Thursday, the hunt was already well underway. That would explain why the kids were scaling his wall in the first place. They were actively searching for leprechauns by that point. In my opinion, if Brian's story is true, it didn't start the leprechaun panic, but probably added fuel to it. So, if Brian didn't start it, what did? A wild rumour that got out of hand is the most likely explanation, but there are two recent comments that I've come across that make me question whether there might be more to this story. One comes from a letter sent to the Liverpool Echo newspaper in October 2009 from a man named Alan Ferndale. So this letter must be responding to a previous letter. He says, David Rogers asks if anyone remembers the leprechaun mania of 1964. I certainly do, and I actually saw a few of them on the Kensington Fields close to the library, but my parents and other adults tried to convince me that I'd been seeing things. This would be one afternoon in early July 1964, around 4:30 p.m, and I remember it as if it was yesterday. I was 10 at the time and on my way to play football with my mates and saw these little, I'd say just a few inches tall, men dressed in red and black standing in the grass looking at me. I'm sure one of them had some type of hat on. I panicked and ran all the way home. My mum said that there'd been reports of leprechauns and little men on Jubilee Drive and Edge Lane the day before. The next comment was left by someone named Linda under a post on the Magonia Magazine Archive website. She says, I was one of the school children that saw those leprechauns. I attended Bray Street School and we all saw them popping in and out of a window overlooking the schoolyard. There were about 4 of them, all tiny, dressed like a schoolbook idea of a typical gnome, and they sat swinging their legs on the window ledge getting in and out. What they were, I don't know. I only know what they looked like. I'd love to know the truth. Now, I've got no way of confirming if either of these accounts is true, but they are interesting, especially the first one, which claims he didn't know about the leprechaun rumours until after his strange experience. It's one thing for kids to claim to see something, but for them to grow into adulthood still believing what they saw is another thing. So let's jump forward 3 years to 1967 and take a look at the case of the Little Blue Man of Studdom Common. So Studdom Common is a patch of green land in the south of England, partially covered by a dense blanket of trees and undergrowth. With houses and a primary school nearby, the common is popular with children who run wild over the place, making little dens and burrows in the thick bushes. A little while before 2 p.m. on the 28th of January 1967, 7 school children aged between 10 and 11 were playing on Studdom Common during their school lunch break. At 1:45 there was a single flash of lightning that seemed to hit the common. Upon seeing the lightning, one of the boys, Alex Butler, cast his eye across a stretch of open ground and saw, about 20 yards away, a strange little man. This man was about 3 feet tall, and he seemed to emit a weird greyish-blue glowing light that made it difficult to see his features clearly. From what they could make out among the glow, he had a long beard which ran down from his mouth area and divided into two as it reached his chest. On his face were two round eyes and a flat triangle shape where his nose would have been. On his head he wore a tall hat or helmet. It was about 2 feet in length and was described as a sort of brimless bowler hat, rounded on the top. The most detailed account I can find only describes his clothes as a one-piece vestment without mentioning any colour, so that's not too helpful, but it does mention that he had a thick black belt which had a black cube of about 6 inches square on the front. Alex called to his friends and together they watched the man from the hiding spot in the bushes. The figure was stood upright and motionless with his hands straight down at his sides. He didn't appear to move the whole time that he was visible. After a little discussion, the children decided to rush down the bank towards the man, but as they got close to him, a cloud of yellowish blue smoke shot out of the box on the little man's belt, obscuring their view of him. The smoke vanished quickly, like vapour, but by the time it had cleared, the man had vanished. The children ran across the common, searching for him. They climbed a small embankment and they spotted him once again. This time he was standing in another clearing on the opposite side of the bush where they'd first seen him. Once more they ran towards him, and once more he blasted a puff of smoke towards them and vanished. After more searching, they spotted him a third time, close to where they'd first seen him. The boys approached quietly and peered at him from behind a bush. It was at this point that they began to hear weird voices coming from inside the bushes. The voices were deep and impossible to understand, described by the children as a continuous foreign-sounding babble. The voices seemed to be communicating with the small glowing man, and he seemed to be talking back to them, although the boys never saw any movement from him. The children were a bit spooked by these voices, so this time they didn't rush towards the figure. Instead, they crept around the outside of the bushes until they were at a spot where they could get a better view of the man, who still stood there like a statue. They watched him for a while longer, but then a whistle was blown from the nearby school, telling them that it was time for their lesson. When they got to school, they excitedly told their teacher, Miss Newcomb, about what they had seen. There must have been something in the children's voices that told Miss Newcomb that this wasn't just some prank or wild fantasy. Instead of dismissing them outright, she separated each child and had them independently write down what they had seen. Each of them wrote a detailed account of their experience, and according to paranormal researchers who later studied these accounts, they were highly convincing and displayed remarkable consistency across accounts. It would be good to read them for myself. Apparently they were compiled into a book titled The Little Blue Man on Studdom Common, but from what I can tell, nobody has been able to track it down. An article in Flying Saucer Review suggests that the book was kept in the archives of Studdom Village Primary School. I did try contacting the school to see if I could get hold of a copy, but I got no response, so that might be an interesting bit of lost media. If anyone's got any information about that book, then please get in touch. I'd love to be able to track it down. But that's pretty much where the story ends. Researchers from the Flying Saucer Review interviewed the school's principals, the children, and Miss Newcomb, and they all seemed convinced that something strange had happened. They did theorise that maybe the beard that the children had seen was in fact some kind of breathing mask and tubes. As far as I know, there have been quite a few sightings of strange lights and objects in the sky around Studdom Common, but nobody else has reported seeing the little blue man. So there we have 3 weird tales from England. You could look at them as genuine encounters with the paranormal, or just examples of mass hysteria, misidentification, and childish imagination. Either way, I think they're interesting. I do find it strange how in the space of 3 years we have 3 very similar stories coming out of England of kids encountering these odd little people. I'm sure with a bit more digging I could find even more stories like this from around that time too. Plus there's probably hundreds more that never get reported. If you read the fairy census or Marjorie Johnson's Seeing Fairies, people do see weird little humanoid things all the time, and very few of these encounters make the headlines, so we don't hear about them. But anyway, that's all the time I've got for today, so I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for tuning in, and as always, thank you to the patrons for the support. Let me know what you think in the comments, and until next time, goodbye.